Welcome to Conversation in Music with Michael Feinstein. Hello everybody, I'm glad to be with you again. This is my Gershwin Gallery. This is the place where I exhibit a lot of the Gershwin memorabilia that I've been able to obtain through the years. Some of it given to me by Ira Gershwin or some of his associates, or things that I've stumbled upon. It sometimes feels to me as if the universe just sends me things to take care of or to preserve or pass on. None of us are here forever, and so I'm very mindful that all the things that I have here need to be saved, and so they will eventually go to other archives such as my Great American Songbook Foundation, and some things to the Library of Congress, where there is a spectacular Gershwin collection. There are other Gershwin collections, and every piece of memorabilia adds to the story. There are many puzzles and questions that come up with the finding of a piece of ephemera, sometimes by a piece of handwriting on something, or an annotation, or just wondering where something comes from and trying to figure out how it fits into the picture. So I'll just go to one corner of this place and start talking about some of the things that are here. It's nice to be able to show you this place because as we progress with these podcasts or broadcasts, I'll probably end up showing you every room in my house except my bathroom. Well, anyway. Okay, so you can tell how well rehearsed this is. All right, well, let's start over here. This is an advertising card for the 1951 MGM film An American in Paris. This is a Belgian advertisement, and I don't remember where I got it, but one of the things that's interesting is that the movie art is relatively the same from country to country for particular features, and this one is very much like the other images that advertised An American in Paris. The film An American in Paris was one that was a compilation of Gershwin music, which was the brainchild of the great Hollywood producer Arthur Freed, who was a close friend of Ira Gershwin's. And the film was directed by Vincent Minnelli, who was one of George and Ira's very close friends. And I met Vincent Minnelli at Ira Gershwin's home, and it was because of my relationship with Vincent that I eventually became friends with his famous daughter, Liza Minnelli. I also was lucky enough to meet Gene Kelly, and found him a fascinating guy, an intellectual and a brilliant mind who could have done anything that he chose to do. He spoke classical Latin and had a knowledge of American popular song that was quite spectacular. But he chose to entertain, to dance, and to share his art in that way, which I think was a great gift to all of us. Below that is a piece of sheet music from one of George and Ira Gershwin's last scores written together. The film was called A Damsel in Distress, and there are two different editions of the sheet music where the billing is slightly changed and this art is different. This particular sheet is autographed by Fred Astaire and also autographed by Joan Fontaine, who by all accounts was Fred Astaire's least talented dancing partner. The last movie that Astaire and Rogers had made, or the previous film before this one, was called Shall We Dance, which had a Gershwin score. And the film at the box office did not do as well as previous Astaire-Rogers ventures. They in all made 10 films, and this one was, I don't know if Shall We Dance was maybe the sixth of that group, sixth or seventh. So they decided to have Fred Astaire team with somebody else for a while, and it might have been the great British musical star Jessie Matthews, but that fell apart because of her husband, Sonny Hale. So they teamed Fred Astaire with Joan Fontaine, who was a quite beautiful and talented actress, but she could neither sing nor dance, which is quite evident in this film. However, the score that they wrote was spectacular. The score included Nice Work If You Can Get It and A Foggy Day in London Town. And George Gershwin died before this film was released because he passed away July 11th, 1937, and hadn't quite finished his work on this movie. So that's Damsel in Distress. This is a reproduction. It's not a reproduction, it's the actual cover of Rhapsody in Blue, which was written in 1924. This was given to me by some friends in this beautiful burled wood frame. And it is not a particularly valuable cover of Rhapsody in Blue, but is beautiful art. And at some point I will show you some other editions of Rhapsody in Blue in subsequent visits together. Below that is a lobby card from An American in Paris. Lobby cards were produced in sets of 8 different images, and they were displayed in the lobbies of movie theaters. And there were different sizes of posters and advertising memorabilia that were used, or ephemera, I should say, for motion pictures. There were always 8 lobby cards. There was always a 1 sheet, which is the standard size poster that we see, half sheets, window cards, inserts, and such. This is called an insert, this format. This is for a movie called The Man I Love, that, except for the title song, has no relation, the content of the film has no relation to the Gershwin brothers. But you can see how they use the song in the advertising of the film. Someday he'll come along, the man I love, and he'll be big and strong, the man I love. The song was sung in the movie by Ida Lupino, but actually she does not do her own vocals in this film. She was dubbed. In other words, her singing voice was supplied by an off-screen singer who was a better vocalist than Ida Lupino was. She was a very talented actress and became a film director and was one of the few very successful female film directors in Hollywood later in the 1950s. This film dates from, I think, 1946, and the person who sang for Ida Lupino was a woman I knew. Her name was Peg LaCentra. I met Peg LaCentra at the home of Ira and Leonore Gershwin when I was working for them. I was playing the recording of the studio disc of The Man I Love, the vocal, for Ira Gershwin. He was listening to it. We were listening to it together. And in walks Ira's friend, the director, not the director, but the actor, Paul Stewart. He also directed. But Paul comes in and he hears this recording and he said, "Who is that singing?" I said, "It's Peg LaCentra. She dubbed for Ida Lupino in The Man I Love." He said, "Oh, I know, she's my wife." And then I realized that Peg, his wife who had been coming over all those years, was the woman who dubbed for Ida Lupino. And I knew the name Peg LaCentra, but I had no idea that his wife Peg was Peg LaCentra, because she had stopped singing years before and didn't ever talk about it. But after that, there was one night at Ira's home where they had a party and I played the piano and Peg sang, and that was a great thrill. So below that is an advertising card for a Broadway musical, George and Ira Gershwin's OK. OK was produced originally on Broadway in 1926. It starred Gertrude Lawrence, and the song Someone to Watch Over Me comes from OK. This was a production that never made it to Broadway. This was, I'd say, around 1980, and it closed, I think, in Washington, D.C. at the Kennedy Center. It never made it past that phase because there were book problems and the thing fell apart. So the only thing that remains is this lobby card. I don't know if there are any recordings out of town, like bootleg recordings of the performances. I don't know, but I always have appreciated that image. Speaking of OK, over here is a poster for a movie version of OK. Now, as I mentioned, OK was a 1926 Broadway musical. And in 1928, First National Pictures made a film of the musical OK. However, in 1928, movies were silent. There was no on-screen talking or music that was sung on screen. There was silent film accompaniment. So this movie was accompanied by either a piano or, in large theaters in larger cities, by an orchestra. So I was always curious to know if these silent film versions of Broadway musicals actually in the orchestra accompaniment featured the songs that were used on Broadway. Well, I found a cue sheet that listed the numbers that accompanied the silent film, and actually they only used the title song, Okay, and they threw out the rest of the Gershwin score. So it's odd that they made silent films of musicals and advertised them, calling more in the gay musical comedy success Okay, even though there was no singing. So that's one of the mysteries of that era of movie making. Over here is an instrumental piece called Promenade. It was published in the late 1950s. This copy is autographed by Ira Gershwin to a very talented pianist named Felix de Cola, who was originally from South Africa and had a long-running radio program in Los Angeles where he combined classical music and popular music. But Promenade actually was an instrumental piece that was written originally for the movie Shall We Dance. It was a sequence that was called Walking the Dog, and it accompanied action of Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers walking on the deck of a ship. And it remained unpublished until many years later when Ira Gershwin one day in the 1950s thought, I wonder what happened to that sequence, Walking the Dog. It'd be fun to publish it as a piano solo. But he couldn't find any music for it. He went to RKO Studios. They didn't have a piano copy of it. So he was thwarted that he couldn't find the music anywhere. And then one day he went to New York and he was at the music publishing house Chapel, and he ran into a man named Hal Bourne. And he said, weren't you the rehearsal pianist on Shall We Dance? And he said, yes, I was. And Ira said, do you remember that Walking the Dog sequence? And Hal said, sure. And he sat down and he played the whole thing from memory. They got a musical secretary who notated it, and therefore Hal Bourne is responsible for the survival of this piano solo, and it was published by Chapel. This is a copy of I Got Rhythm, autographed by Ethel Merman. This is a later printing that doesn't have the graphics from the musical from 1930. It's autographed to Donald Smith, who was my early publicist in New York. Signed, Love Ethel, that's Ethel Merman, of whom Irving Berlin said, you'd better never write a bad song for Ethel, because if you do, you'll hear it. Girl Crazy was Ethel Merman's debut on Broadway. She was around 18 years old, and she was a sensational success in the show. She stopped the show with I Got Rhythm and had to repeat the number several times, and the next day the reviews came out in the papers. And George Gershwin called her and said, you're a star. And she said, what are you talking about? He said, well, have you seen the reviews? And she said, what's that? She didn't even know about reviews, and he showed her the papers, and she became literally an overnight success, even though she'd been knocking around for a bit. But this is the show that made her a star. A number of years later, after she had gotten her own place in Manhattan, and she no longer was living in Astoria, Long Island with her family, she got an apartment and she got some paintings, and a friend was visiting her and looked at this oil painting and said, Ethel, that's a beautiful painting. Who is it by? And she said, it's an original. That to Ethel was the height of success. Didn't matter who painted it. Okay, this is Hi Ho. This is a song that was written for but not used in the film Shall We Dance? Again, signed by Ira Gershwin to Felix de Cola. So that's a Hirschfeld drawing of the Gershwins that was originally done in the 1950s. Below that, it's a little bit hard to see. Let me see if I can take this off. This is score paper that belonged to George Gershwin, and the reason I have it framed is because at the bottom there it says, manufactured for George Gershwin. This is one of the sheets of paper that was left on his piano after he died, and Ira Gershwin gave it to me, so I thought it's sort of a representation of what might have been, but never happened. So, this is a photo of George Gershwin with Paul Whiteman and Dana Suisse. Paul Whiteman was the man who in 1924 premiered Rhapsody in Blue, which was the piece of music that made George Gershwin an overnight success. The piece was premiered on February 12th, 1924. This is a photo taken probably in the late 20s, early 30s. Dana Suisse was a good friend of George Gershwin, and she was an equally talented composer. Women didn't have as many opportunities in those days, but sadly, or I should say, sadly, that Dana Suisse didn't get opportunities that she should have had. She also wrote a number of popular songs, including You Ought to Be in Pictures. Above that is a flyer for the 1930 film The King of Jazz, which was a film that Universal Studios made in an attempt to revive their fortunes during the Depression, but the film was a financial failure and almost drove them into bankruptcy. However, it was the first motion picture to feature a performance of the complete Rhapsody in Blue, for which George Gershwin was paid an astronomical amount of money. Now, if we go over here, this is an advertisement, speaking of Rhapsody in Blue. This appeared in a musical trade paper, and it's announcing this forthcoming concert that would premiere Rhapsody in Blue. Paul Whiteman and his Palais Royal Orchestra. The Palais Royal was a nightclub where Whiteman played in the 1920s. Will offer an experiment in modern music, assisted by Zez Confrey, who was a famous composer and pianist of novelties, and George Gershwin. New, typically American compositions by Messrs. Victor Herbert, Zez Confrey, and George Gershwin will be played for the first time. Tuesday, February 12, 1924, Aeolian Hall. Well, the composition referred to here was Rhapsody in Blue. And the other works that were on the bill, such as a piece by Victor Herbert called A Suite of Serenades, got scant attention compared to Rhapsody in Blue. Victor Herbert, who was the reigning king of American music at that time, wrote extraordinary musicals and operettas, died shortly after Rhapsody in Blue was premiered. So in some ways it was like a passing of the baton. This is a page from the first performance of the piece An American in Paris that was premiered at Carnegie Hall Thursday, December 13th, 1928. And this was given to me by the son of Fred Allard, who was a songwriter and friend of George Gershwin's, who was present at that performance. I wish that he had kept the program intact as opposed to tearing it apart and framing it, but there we are. So, let's see here. Let's go back over to this wall. This is an advertisement for the Decca Records Company from June of 1939, advertising all the different Gershwin songs that they offer on their record label. And it's fascinating because even though George Gershwin had been dead 2 years at that point, his legend was growing and all of these recordings were happening, and it was sort of the beginning of the true appreciation for George Gershwin, because in his own life he was often maligned. People said that his concert works were not true concert music and he didn't really know what he was doing. And Paul Whiteman in the late 1930s did a set of recordings of Rhapsody in Blue, Gershwin's second Rhapsody, Cuban Overture, An American in Paris, the Concerto in F. And it was these recordings that helped to give legitimacy to George Gershwin in the concert hall. In 1945, Warner Brothers released a film biography of George Gershwin. The film was called Rhapsody in Blue. The film was actually completed in 1943, but it wasn't released until the end of the Second World War. This is a beautiful piece of art from the film. And one night at a Hollywood party where I was playing the piano, I met an actor named Herbert Rudley. Herbert Rudley actually portrayed Ira Gershwin in the movie Rhapsody in Blue. So Mr. Rudley signed the poster and Ira signed it as well. So it's probably the only example of both of them signing on this poster. Leonard Gershwin signed it. And George Gershwin was played by Robert Alda. Robert Alda is the father of Alan Alda, who most of you know from the television series MASH, and this is another picture of Robert Alda. And his fictitious love interest in the film was played by Joan Leslie, and this is Joan Leslie, who for many years was my neighbor in Los Feliz. The film, I must say, is not a great motion picture, but the musical performances in it are quite wonderful because many of the people who knew and worked with Gershwin were still alive, and it memorialized a number of performances that otherwise might have gotten lost. Over here is a picture of me at the home of Ira Gershwin. This picture was taken, probably around 1978, I would say. And On this side is a self-portrait of George Gershwin. On this side is a self-portrait of Ira Gershwin. And it shows the differences between the two brothers. They were both extraordinarily gifted artists. George did this beautiful reproduction of himself holding a palette. Is that what you call it? A painter's palette. And Ira painted himself in yellow underwear with his paunch sticking out. This is a picture of Ira in 1946 when he was best man at the wedding of Vincent Minnelli to Judy Garland. And that is Louis B. Mayer, the feared head of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. This is a poster given to me by Ira Gershwin that was created in 1968 when the Museum of the City of New York did an extraordinary exhibition of Gershwiniana. Ira Gershwin donated most of his Gershwin memorabilia to the Museum of the City of New York, and this was the only time that they had a large-scale exhibition of all of that memorabilia, which I don't believe has ever been displayed since then, and I'm told that it sits in a storage space somewhere under the Brooklyn Bridge. Ira signed the poster for me and affixed a canceled check signature of George Gershwin to that. This is a photo of George and Ira Gershwin up here, when you come up here. That was taken in 1937 by Rex Hardy Jr. of Time magazine. That photo was taken, I think, in March of 1937, and George Gershwin died in July of 1937. So this is the last photo taken of the two of them together, and I framed it with a canceled check signed by Ira Gershwin and by George Gershwin, dated December 8th, 1930, from Beverly Hills. This is when they first came to Hollywood to work on a movie called Delicious, which was their first film score, which was not successful. So over here is what they call a half sheet from the movie Shall We Dance, autographed by Fred Astaire. The Gershwins get very nice billing there. And then Shall We Dance, as I mentioned earlier, was followed by A Damsel in Distress, which was released later in 1937 after George Gershwin's passing. This is a photo of Ira that was a passport photo, and he gave that to me because he was about to throw it away. And I said, "Don't throw that away." And he said, "You want it?" I said, "Yeah." And he gave it to me. That, I would say, was probably done in the 1950s, early 1950s. Now, this is a fascinating piece of memorabilia. After George Gershwin died in 1940, Ira Gershwin worked on a Broadway show called Lady in the Dark with the composer Kurt Weill. It was the first major thing that Ira did after George's passing. For 3 years, Ira did very, very little. He was in a deep depression after the passing of his brother, who passed away July 11th, 1937, at the age of 38. And so eventually, Ira started working on another show, and it was called Lady in the Dark, with a story by Moss Hart. And it was about psychoanalysis, because Moss Hart had recently been seeing a psychiatrist, and he got the idea to write a show about it. So, in that show, it was not a conventional Broadway musical. There were dream sequences. So it started out as a straight play, and then Gertrude Lawrence, who plays this woman, Liza Elliott, who's the editor of a fashion magazine who can't make up her mind about anything, goes into psychoanalysis. And as she lays on the psychiatrist's couch, she has these visions or memories or dreams that turn into these Technicolor production numbers, or these long sequences, dream sequences. So this is a lyric sheet for one of the dream sequences. The top part was written for a San Fernando Valley sequence that was deleted from the show. So this never happened. It was a cowboy song that never happened. But this part is part of Ira's worksheet for a song that became quite popular at the time called My Ship. My Ship was the leitmotif of the show Lady in the Dark. It's the song that Gertrude Lawrence keeps humming but can't remember the words to. And eventually, at the end of the show, when she has a successful outcome from her psychoanalysis, she's able to remember all the lyrics of the song. So Ira was still working on the song. So this is his worksheet for the bridge of the song. And it says, "Oh, I'll wait for years till my ship appears, one fine day, one spring." And then underneath he has, On a fine day, one fine spring. So he hadn't decided which line he wants to use, and there's a question mark next to it. But the diamonds and such all won't mean much if that day lacks just one thing. That's very close to what he eventually used for the song. And then the last part of it has the general idea of what he wants to express in the song, but hasn't gotten there yet. The rest of the song is, I do not care if that day arrives, that dream need never be. But if the ship I sing doesn't also bring my own true love to me. So this is the idea that he's trying to go for here. But my ship needn't ever sail the foam, sail the blue. My ship doesn't ever, if my ship doesn't be, when she arrives, she doesn't bring happiness. My love, my love. So this is the idea from which he eventually created those beautiful lyrics. This is a poster for one of George Gershwin's last concert appearances, Constitution Hall, National Symphony, Washington, D.C. Never seen another one of these, but there might be another one out there. This is a memo pad that I found in a stationery store, and I bought it and I showed it to Ira Gershwin. Now the problem with it is that the song from Girl Crazy is I Got Rhythm, not I've Got Rhythm. Ira used that vernacular intentionally, so when I showed it to him, he crossed out the VE and wrote corrected by the lyricist Ira Gershwin, because it should be I Got Rhythm. Now above that are little doodles by George Gershwin. I have a number of them. There's two here, and if you look over here, there's another one. This one is a self-caricature of George Gershwin. And on the back of it, I think there's another one. Yeah, this is the back of it. When George Gershwin would speak on the telephone, he would mindlessly doodle. And as he doodled, he would draw these little figures. They were almost always faces, and they were almost always male faces. When he finished, when he would hang up, he'd throw the thing into the wastebasket, and unbeknownst to him, his houseman, Paul Mueller, saved them. And after Gershwin died in later 1937, Paul Mueller gave this shoebox filled with these little telephone doodles to Ira and Leonore Gershwin, and they framed a group of them and gave them to friends. Now, this is a special one that Lee Gershwin gave to me because it's a self-portrait of George, and Leonore felt that the one above was of her. And it's very possible because it does resemble Lee, and if so, it's the only female face that I ever saw of those hundreds of caricatures that survived. That's the only female one. At the top it says, Mr. Simon called. Mr. Simon was Dick Simon of Simon & Schuster, who is the father of the great songwriter and entertainer Carly Simon. So, this is the first edition printing of An American in Paris. It was an orchestral tone poem, but it was printed as a piano solo, and George Gershwin autographed it to Dick Simon. To my dear friend Dick, hoping we get together on that book, with admiration, George Gershwin, November 1929. Well, the book that they were talking about was a George Gershwin songbook that was eventually published in 1932, and I will show you that at some point. This is a one sheet from the film An American in Paris. It's very similar, as you will see, to the Belgian image, except this is a photograph and that's a drawing. This is the 1957 film Funny Face, which starred Audrey Hepburn and Fred Astaire. Interesting to me that Audrey Hepburn got top billing over Fred Astaire. It looks like this thing has faded a bit because this pink lettering is faint, and that's what happens with things when they are exposed to light. This lighting might have sadly faded this a little bit, which disturbs me, but I'll have to do something about that. Let's go back to this side here. This is a poster from the Barclays of Broadway, which is a film that reunited Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers in 1948, is when it was in production. It was the 10th film that Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers made together, and originally the film was supposed to star Fred Astaire and Judy Garland, but Judy Garland became ill and couldn't work on the movie, so they got Ginger Rogers instead. Now, the score for this movie was written by Ira Gershwin and Harry Warren. Harry Warren is a person who was one of my favorite people who won 3 Academy Awards for Lullaby of Broadway, You'll Never Know, and On the Atchison Topeka, and the Santa Fe. The screenplay is by Betty Compton and Adolph Green, and one day I was with Betty and Adolph and sang and played several songs written by Warren and Gershwin for this film, and their comment was, well, not top drawer Harry or Ira. And it's true that the film score was not their best work, either of them together or individually. But a number of the songs that they wrote for the Barclays of Broadway were intended for Judy Garland, and when Ginger came on the scene, they pulled those songs because they didn't feel that Ginger would be able to vocally handle some of the material. The most beautiful being a song called There Is No Music, which was sort of lyrically a precursor to what became The Man That Got Away, and I'll sing that for you at some point. Over here we have a Christmas card that was one of the custom cards that Ira and Leonore Gershwin had created every year. This one came from the late 1950s. It's another one that belonged to one of the Simon brothers, Al Simon, who was the brother of Dick Simon. After Al Simon passed away, he had willed to me all of his Gershwin memorabilia. So it's signed from Ira Gershwin to Al. It says, beside all good wishes, many thanks for the Gertrude Lawrence album, and I'm delighted you liked LOSO, which is Lyrics on Several Occasions, which was the only book that Ira Gershwin wrote about his work. This is another holiday card to Ira and Leonore's dear friends Milton and Cecilia Ager. Milton Ager was a man who wrote Happy Days Are Here Again, Ain't She Sweet, Hard-Hearted Hannah, I Wonder What's Become of Sally. His wife, Cecilia Ager, was a very well-known film critic in the 1930s, and her film criticism was so highly regarded that it was later collected into a book by, I think, Alistair Cook called Garbo and the Night Watchman. So they were both very interesting people. This is another telephone doodle by George Gershwin. This is a little lyric sheet by Ira Gershwin. This is from 1964. The last film that Ira ever worked on was called Kiss Me Stupid. And that film featured 3 songs for which Ira wrote lyrics and took trunk melodies of his brother George's and fashioned lyrics to them. Unfortunately, the plot of the film was about songwriters, 2 songwriters who are amateurs, and so Ira had to write songs that were ones that might have been written by an amateur, and he succeeded. And so I don't think the songs are his best work. This is the first album that was made, first record album in the early 1950s, entirely devoted to the lyrics of Ira Gershwin. In 1980, Ira Gershwin autographed it to me, and David Craig, one of the participants on the album, signed it for me. And this image is by Al Hirschfeld. It was originally drawn for 17 magazine, and Al Hirschfeld signed that for me, as you can see over here, in 1986, which is shortly before he actually did a caricature of me. So that's the famous Hirschfeld signature. A little hard to see from that angle, but there you go, Hirschfeld. Now, below that is a photograph of George Gershwin taken in 1933 by Carl Van Vechten. And below that is a piece of music paper that is one that is orchestral paper that shows the instrumentation. And again, it has George Gershwin's name on it. And then over here is a photograph that was given to me by somebody of George Gershwin's hands. And I don't know anything more about it, except I know that it is his hands, but I don't know when or where. This is a manuscript in the hand of George Gershwin. This was created in 1932 when he was working on a Gershwin songbook. It was a book that was published by Simon & Schuster, and George Gershwin was asked to create piano variations of his songs, piano solos, to echo the way that he played his works at parties. And so he created these different piano variations for 18 of his songs. This was his idea of a piano variation for the song, but not for me. It did not end up going into the songbook. And so it just contains his ideas of how he would further flesh out this piano variation. So it is just a sort of musical shorthand with his ideas, the introduction, how he would start it, and the way he would finish it. One of the things that I find fascinating about this is there are certain sections of this piece that were remembered by Oscar Levant and played by him some 15 years later on a recording that I have. So it's fascinating that Oscar Levant obviously heard George Gershwin play this variation on But Not For Me, even though it wasn't completely notated. And it's one that survived in the head of Oscar and now on a recording. Well, I think that I'm going to move to the piano now because there's so much more in this gallery that I'm going to save it for Gershwin Gallery Part 2 or maybe Part 3. So let's sidle this way and I'll take you back to my out-of-tune studio piano. There is one thing I will show you though, because I've been speaking about the George Gershwin songbook. So let me show you that songbook so you can see what I'm referring to. This songbook was published, as I mentioned, in 1932. To find copies with the dust jacket is very difficult. The illustrations were done by Archival, and it's a beautiful book. It's a wonderful book, and it has these wonderful illustrations by Archival, and then it has the songs, the 18 Gershwin songs that are advertised, and then following that it has his piano variations on those songs. So what you saw before, But Not For Me, was one of those piano variations that didn't make it into the book. Oh, and this is a book given to me by Ira Gershwin. He said that all songwriters use rhyming dictionaries, and if they say they don't, they're liars, because rhyming dictionaries are things that are very helpful when one needs to come up with lyrics. This rhyming dictionary he gave to me because he had 2 copies of. I didn't know why he had 2 copies until I opened it up and saw that it was signed by Yip Harburg. So it's probably the rhyming dictionary that Ira gave to Yip. Yip Harburg he had a hardware business, and then during the Depression, when he went bankrupt, Ira sent him a rhyming dictionary and said it's time to get to work. And I believe that this was that book. But Harburg evidently left it at Ira's home, and so it came back to Ira. And, it's got Ira's additions to suggested rhymes. So this is Ira's handwriting. Where, or Pandora, Bora. He's just adding other possible rhymes. Let's see if there's any others in here. What was that? Russia, Shusha, Husha. Let's see. Oh, like Ania, Anglomania, Bibliomania, Dipsomania, Monomania. He added Ruritania, Pennsylvania. Oh, here's one more. Attery, battery, tattery, flattery. He added chattery, cattiness, attiness, chattiness, fattiness, nattiness, cattiness. So that's fun. Okay, to the piano. I think the most appropriate song to sing is the last song that the Gershwins wrote together. Certainly there are a lot of unknown or unusual songs that I could also share with you, but in light of where we are in our world right now, this one feels the most appropriate. George died at the age of 38. Ira was 18 months older than George, and he couldn't believe that George had passed because George had a brain tumor, and by the time they discovered what was wrong with him, it was too late to do anything that ultimately could have saved his life. And his passing was such an extraordinary shock that people could not believe that Gershwin had passed, that he was gone. And Ira was so devastated by George's passing that he really didn't want to go on with life. He had no desire to continue and didn't understand why fate was so cruel as to take George away when he was on the cusp of writing so much more music. He was going to write a symphony, a string quartet, another musical with DuBose Hayward to follow Porgy and Bess, and it all died with him. And so Ira had been writing this particular song with George, and George died before it was completely finished. George had written the music for the chorus. The entire refrain musically was finished, even though he hadn't written it down. So it was Oscar Levant who remembered and notated the chorus of the music. Ira refined his lyric, and then he wrote words and music, the verse or the introductory part of the song. Years later, Vernon Duke claimed that he had composed it, but Ira objected to that, saying, it's obvious that I wrote that verse music because it's so undistinguished. I do not agree with that assessment, particularly because the words are so profound. They are Ira's heartfelt farewell to his brother. The more I read the papers, the less I comprehend the world and all its capers, and how it all will end. Nothing seems to be lasting, but that isn't our affair. We've got something permanent, I mean in the way we care. It's very clear our love is here to stay. Not for a year, but ever and a day. The radio and the telephone and the movies that we know may just be passing fancies, and in time may go. But oh my dear, our love is here to stay. Together we're going a long, long way. In time the Rockies may crumble, Gibraltar may tumble. They're only made of clay, but our love is here to stay. Radio and the telephone and the movies that we know may just be passing fancies, and in time may go. But oh my dear, our love is here to stay. Together we're going a long, long way. In time the Rockies may crumble, Gibraltar may tumble. They're only made of clay, but our love is here.